Okay, so we're going to talk about carbon capture in the Bay Delta because folks requested this topic because we've been talking about it in terms of some items that have come up at the Metropolitan Water District meetings in the last few months, and it's been interesting. And I wanted to do a bit of a deeper dive and really kind of look at what's going on out there, because there are different agencies and entities doing some of these programs. So while this is jargon heavy, I thought it was pretty interesting. Okay, so, the world is reeling from ever increasing climate disaster, and that's linked to soaring carbon emissions from industrialized practices and behaviors, as most of us know at this point. One response is to try to capture that carbon and store it below ground out of the atmosphere. Some common examples of projects include reforestation, building renewable energy, carbon storing practices, and waste and landfill management. Carbon capture and sequestration, or CCS, is a phrase describing the process of capturing that carbon. And in most contexts, they're talking about geologic carbon sequestration, but that's not always what they mean. Carbon capture and storage is the process of capturing and storing carbon dioxide, or CO2, that is produced by human activities. Most of this CO2 is formed by the combustion of fossil fuels, primarily petroleum and coal. The process of CCS prevents the release of this greenhouse gas into the Earth's atmosphere, where it would accumulate. Geological sequestration, or geologic carbon storage, is a type of CCS that uses the natural trapping ability of the Earth's deep subsurface environment to store CO2 that has been injected into that realm. Carbon dioxide is initially captured from a place where it is created, such as a fossil fuel fired power generation facility, an oil refinery, a cement kiln, or an ethanol plant. At such point sources, the carbon dioxide is concentrated enough to make the separation and compression of the gas feasible. The gas is then transported by pipeline to a geological sequestration site for injection and then confinement. Specific conditions are required within the deep subsurface geological environment to effectively store the injected carbon dioxide. These include a porous and permeable reservoir, which I thought was a little surprising, but then an impermeable seal or a confining unit overlie the reservoir, and it needs adequate depth to contain that carbon dioxide as a dense fluid in what is termed a supercritical state. So it's actually a fluid once it's all the way down there. Sorry, lost my place. The carbon dioxide must be stored where it cannot migrate out of the storage reservoir into other subsurface resources, including groundwater and other mineral deposits that might be used in the future. Mineral deposits, what they really mean is oil. The emplacement and storage of large volumes of carbon dioxide into a storage reservoir must be very effective for a long period of time. Slow leakage back into the atmosphere would just negate the value of the practice. It would defeat the purpose. There are essentially two types of reservoirs used for a geological sequestration: injection into a sandstone or other porous reservoir that currently contains salt water, termed saline aquifer storage, and injection into a hydrocarbon-bearing strata such as an oil or gas reservoir, a gas shale, or a coal seam. In each of these reservoirs, the effort of storing the carbon dioxide in the pore space of the rock is accompanied by the process of pushing out hydrocarbons, either oil or gas, for production at the surface. In both types of reservoirs, details about the geology and the unique processes that take place within the storage zone must be carefully investigated and understood for the sequestration process to be effective. Much of the information about these reservoirs and their accompanying seals that is necessary for building this understanding can be derived from existing investigations about the deep subsurface environment. Oil and gas fields and other deep subsurface operations, such as waste injection systems, provide essential information about the rock strata necessary for designing and operating a sequestration system. Careful documentation of the context of a sequestration operation is also necessary, both in the subsurface and on the surface. The impact of the injection process includes the construction of pipelines and wells that must be properly sited. The operational conditions of the sequestration system need to be designed and implemented to accommodate the strength of the rocks in the reservoir, seal, and the overlying rock column. Injection pressures, well spacing, and construction specifications, and carbon dioxide volumes must all conform with the geological characteristics of the area where the project is sited. To ensure that the operations during and after the injection phase of the sequestration project function appropriately, a suite of practices collectively known as monitoring, verification, and accounting, or MVMA, are applied. These MVA practices involve using technologies and procedures that monitor the observable aspects of the sequestration processes, verify that the operation conforms to the design specification, and accounts for the amount of carbon dioxide stored in the reservoir. All these processes are necessary to assure that the sequestration process is safe, effective, and it can be validated well into the future. So we've discussed in the past in the ongoing research around the state into CCS, especially in the Bay Delta and Kern County, as well as some of the concerns that these are environmental justice areas, and slow carbonic leaks below the surface are unpredictable and can cause geysers to form when they're in aquatic environments. These are the things that we've been concerned about for a year or two now within our working group. So there are a couple different ways that we can store carbon. But why is it so important? Well, California's law on carbon dioxide capture and storage, or the California Climate Plan, was enacted this year, 2022, late 2022, and directs the state to sequester 20 million metric tons by 2030. The law was the result of significant negotiation. Climate and EJ groups have argued its merits as a climate solution are limited, noting that the technology can also then prolong toxic fossil fuel infrastructure while failing to sequester carbon dioxide despite billions of dollars in investment. Technology proponents point out that the facilities with the ability to capture 244 million metric tons of carbon dioxide are in development worldwide, but that's less than 0.01% of the world's annual emissions. But the UN says it could be substantially more by 2050. So the UN says, well, keep investing and keep working on it. We can kind of advance this technology. But, you know, we still have a way to go. Managed wetlands deposit dead plants on the bottom of the water, and they add up to 3 centimeters of soil per year. They are, however, neither easy nor cheap to create, which is why local authorities started looking at carbon markets. So state and federal funding remains insufficient to address land subsidence that threatens the California water system, and carbon market revenues could help fill the funding gap, according to Campbell Ingram of the Delta Conservancy. And the American Carbon Registry approved the methodology for generating carbon offsets by converting sunken farms to managed wetlands or rice plantations in the Delta. Those offsets can then be sold to people and companies looking to reduce their carbon footprints, initially through the voluntary carbon market, and perhaps through the state's cap and trade program, under which power plants and oil refineries are required by law to reduce or offset their emissions. The key concept is that offset credits are used to convey a net climate benefit from one entity to another. Because greenhouse gases mix globally in the atmosphere, it doesn't matter where exactly they're reduced. So from a climate change perspective, the effects are the same if an organization ceases an emission-causing activity or if it enables an equivalent emission-reducing activity somewhere else in the world. Carbon offsets are intended to make it easier and more cost-effective for organizations to pursue that second option. The idea started in the 1990s, but gained traction in 2008 when California passed the legislation that governs its cap and trade program. Under California's cap and trade program, which officially launched in January 2013, the state's largest sources of greenhouse gas emissions are required to meet the regulatory greenhouse gas emission caps to contain costs up to 8% of the compliance obligation of capped entities, estimated at about 200 million tons, can be met with Air Resource Board offset credits. If that's not clear how that works, we can go over that again later. So shout out to Wes for alerting me to this issue. So I'm not advocating for or against SB 438, just some new information came out in the press that I thought was worth noting while we're talking about carbon capture. SB 438 purports to clarify the state's rules governing carbon dioxide capture and storage, which prohibits companies from injecting fluid gaseous carbon dioxide into the ground in order to produce more oil. The bill says companies will not be penalized for inadvertently pulling up oil while burying the carbon dioxide. We don't want the environmentalists to see what we're really up to. That is what Theo Peos, a managing partner for a firm whose clients include Calpine Corporation and the California Independent Petroleum Association, told Capital and Maine in an unusually frank interview. Peos was talking about plans by lobbyists to change a bill meant to regulate the industry's handling of carbon dioxide in a way that would mislead lawmakers and environmentalists. To be blunt, he added, we are misadvertising what the bill does and what our intention is. So SB 438 purports to clarify the state's rules governing carbon dioxide capture and storage, which prohibit companies from injecting fluid gaseous carbon dioxide in the ground in order to produce more oil. The bill says companies will not be penalized if they inadvertently pull it up while burying the carbon dioxide, but this is a red herring, Peos said. He said he and other lobbyists intend to push for changing the bill later in the legislative session so that it instead speeds up approvals for carbon dioxide pipelines by handing greater authority to state regulators who are under a lot of pressure to meet emissions reduction goals within the decade. Yet that could undermine a key compromise in California's current carbon capture law while exposing communities to little understood hazards from the pipeline leaks. Using highly pressurized carbon dioxide to stimulate oil production in depleted fields has been around for decades, and that's known as enhanced oil recovery. But more recently, carbon capture and burial has been touted as a climate solution. The industry in particular has led efforts to rebrand this old drilling technique as a 21st century answer to the climate crisis. In some situations, such as at a gas power plant in Kern County, companies may be able to capture carbon dioxide and bury it in a nearby oil patch, but others will still have to transport it hundreds of miles from refineries and gas plants in LA and the Bay Area to declining oil and gas fields in the Central Valley. Changing the approval process would undo a moratorium on interstate carbon dioxide pipelines, which currently cannot be approved until federal regulators finalize the safety laws. The industry believes this conflicts with company plans to start doing carbon capture quickly. And a state agency warned the slower pace puts California at risk of missing its climate targets. We put that decoy language in so we could move it through the legislative process. And then when we get it to the Natural Resources Committee, we're going to switch out the language for the language that we really want, he explained. SB 438 sailed through the Senate, earning votes from climate stalwarts, but experts who spoke with Capital and Maine said the bill's filler language, which claims to shield companies from penalties for inadvertently pulling up the carbon dioxide barrel, didn't make geological sense. It's unwise to inject carbon dioxide in the ground without pulling up oil or gas or brine, because this messes with its mass balance or the pressure of the underground shelf, said Steve Meltzer, a geological engineer who's consulted for oil companies and the Department of Energy. Put too much in without taking anything out, and the result could be earthquakes. If you're going to put a mass of carbon in a reservoir, you'll raise pressures if you're not pulling something out. So this is concerning and something to watch and something to consider in light of other tragedies. February 22nd, 2020, residents saw a big white cloud shooting into the evening sky in Satartia, Mississippi. A woman and her grandchildren waited for their dad to come hide from the cloud under blankets with them, but she didn't know that her sons and her nephew were just down the road, unconscious, victims of a mass poisoning from a carbon dioxide pipeline rupture. As the carbon dioxide moved through the rural community, more than 200 people evacuated and at least 45 people were hospitalized. Cars stopped working, hobbling the emergency response. People lay on the ground, shaking and unable to breathe. First responders didn't know what was going on. It looked like you were going through the zombie apocalypse, said Jack Willingham, an emergency director for the county. In one 911 call, a mother pleaded for help because her daughter couldn't breathe, and you could hear her hacking audibly in the background. In another call, a stranded highway described what was happening to a friend. She's laying on the ground and she's shaking. She's kind of drooling out of the mouth. I don't know if she's having a seizure or not. Humans always breathe some carbon dioxide, but too much causes a thirst for oxygen, disorientation, and heart malfunction. Extreme exposures to carbon dioxide can lead to death by asphyxiation. The use of carbon dioxide to kill pigs in abattoirs is now under scrutiny over whether it complies with federal laws on humane slaughter, but that's another issue. Carbon dioxide in open air can't disperse, but third-party air monitoring that night in Satartia showed that potent clouds of carbon dioxide can sometimes hang in the air for hours. It quickly became clear that the cloud of carbon dioxide was hampering the emergency response. Combustion engines need oxygen to work, and as the carbon dioxide displaced oxygen in the air, that's why many of these cars stopped running. A firefighter helped get these men to the hospital. The medical team at the hospital sent them home after a few hours, but the following day, still struggling to breathe, they came back to the hospital. They ended up taking oxygen tanks around with them for several months after this incident. Doctors at the local hospital treated patients who were in the area the night of the pipeline rupture, including residents and first responders. Patients with asthma show some increased frequency and severity of their asthmatic exacerbations. So now, 3 years after the carbon dioxide poisoning from the pipeline break, some in Satartia see the incident as a warning at a critical moment for the U.S. climate policy. The country is looking at a dramatic expansion of its carbon dioxide pipeline network, thanks in part to billions of dollars of incentives in 2022's climate legislation. This just past May, the Biden administration announced $251 million for a dozen climate projects that focus on carbon dioxide transport and storage. The Pipeline Safety Trust says many pipelines will be even closer to communities than the one in Satartia. The Delta was once home to about 80% of California's fishery species, and as we know, it's the West Coast's largest estuary in both North and South America. As you know, it's also part of the Pacific Flyway for migratory water birds and the biggest, though wetlands cover less than 10% of the Earth's surface, they're estimated to house up to 30% of the total carbon stored in the Earth's soils. Since the 1800s, nearly all of California's wetlands have been drained, filled, and converted to other uses. That includes more than 90% of the Bay Area's tidal wetlands. Drying of these wetland soils and subsequent agricultural use has caused the Delta's landscape to subside by up to 25 feet below sea level. It also releases an estimated 1 to 2 billion tons of carbon dioxide each year, according to the Delta Conservancy. Those soils formed over 7,000 years. Once they were drained, the microbes basically went crazy and augmented their consumption of the organic carbon that is so rich in these soils. The estimate is that we have half of the organic soil that was there prior to 1850, said a Delta Conservancy expert. Farming in the Delta is a double-edged sword. As farmers churn up the peat soil to dry it for planting, the carbon in it reacts with oxygen in the air to form the greenhouse gas carbon dioxide, which is then soon gone with the wind along with the soil. Because the soil keeps disappearing, farmers keep digging it up, and the islands keep sinking, threatening both their own livelihoods and the entire state's drinking water if those levees ever give way on a really big scale. Through thousands of years of sea level rise, wetland plants grew in saturated soils within the Delta. So this created peat, which you can see here on the left, which is a highly organic and carbon-rich dirt. In many areas of the Delta, water has been removed from the root zone in order to plant corn, because corn cannot be planted in wet soil, and Americans love corn. Removing the water exposes the soil to oxygen, and microbes begin to eat the peat. This process reduces peat and then releases that carbon dioxide. Subsidence can be compared to the process of burning a log, where heat converts the mass of the log into a gas. With subsidence in the delta, microbes convert the mass of carbon into gas, which is carbon dioxide and then particulate matter, so the peat is dissolving. Currently, subsidence in the delta is continuing at a rate of about 1 to 1.5 inches per year. There are about 200,000 acres of deeply subsided land with some areas at 25 feet or more below sea level. Subsidence is a threat to California's water supply, and highly subsided areas are a large source of carbon emissions. So what do we do about it? Delta Conservancy Board adopted a climate change policy in 2012 to reduce these carbon emissions. To address the problem of subsidence and the release of carbon in the Delta, the Conservancy has worked with a large partnership to develop pilot projects for carbon sequestration in the Delta. The group secured funding and developed a California Wetland Protocol, which was adopted by the American Carbon Registry, or ACR, in the spring of 2017. The protocol allows landowners to stop subsidence of the land by growing tule as part of a managed wetland or cultivating rice, and then take the quantified emission reductions to the voluntary carbon market. You might remember that presentation from I believe it was the Environmental Defense Fund, when they talked about the rice and the cranes and the symbiotic relationship there a few months ago. That was probably part of this program. A voluntary carbon market is a decentralized market where private actors voluntarily buy and sell carbon credits that represent certified removals or reductions of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. The partnership is currently working with public and private landowners and project developers to build pilot projects that can verify greenhouse gas emission reduction credits and realize revenue by trading credits on the voluntary carbon market. If the voluntary protocol can be demonstrated, the Air Resources Board will consider adopting the protocol under the cap and trade compliance market and thereby double the value of the credits and add further incentive for change, according to the Conservancy. So where does Metropolitan Water District fit into this? Well, as we know, Metropolitan, or MET, purchased 5 islands in the Delta in 2016 in anticipation of the Twin Tunnels, which would have just bored right through those islands. After we defeated the Twin Tunnels, they no longer needed the islands. In 2021, they sold one of the islands to the Department of Water Resources. They have 4 islands now in a freshwater pathway. They co-own 3 of these islands, and on one of the islands, they have 3 or 14 co-owners, but they own all of Webb Tract. For now, they are holding on to these islands. Increased health of the Delta means stronger banks and levees and better water quality, which then creates some reliability for their allocations of the state water project. To improve Delta health, they are seeking to develop food production or zooplankton for the fish, restore native tule vegetation to rebuild peat soils, to increase land elevation and reduce carbon emissions while protecting the quality of drinking water sources. They are seeking to convert some lands to non-tidal wetlands to preserve cultivated land with food for birds, to improve waterfowl habitat and help protect threatened and endangered bird species, and restore tidal wetlands as being done on Chips Island, which Metropolitan recently sold. That's the one that they just sold to the Department of Water Resources for that purpose, actually, to restore the tidal wetlands. Met is working on a collaborative plan for their islands. The Estuary magazine in March of this year said the feedback-heavy style of decision-making contributes to a leadership change at Metropolitan Water District that prioritizes innovation, inclusion, collaboration, and partnerships, which I think is important because it's an improvement over previous management. Things probably wouldn't have been this way, 5 years ago. So the fact that they're reaching out and working with more organizations is a big deal, and we can pat ourselves on the back for hurrying that along. Their goals for the collaborative planning include addressing subsidence reversal, carbon sequestration, ecosystem restoration, and sustainable economic and agricultural practices. So let's look at some of their projects specifically. So Metropolitan's Delta Island Collaborative Landscape Planning in Phase 1 led to the selection of Bolden Island for their adaptation projects. So here's a look in more detail about the proposed projects for this island. Funded under Prop 1 Watershed Restoration Grants, this collaborative co-design planning process has two phases. First phase is to select the island that offers the best opportunity for island-wide landscape scale scenario planning. Phase 1 was completed in summer 2022 based on feedback from public meetings and surveys, and that's when they selected Bolden Island. And they came up with a Phase 1 final report. I can send it to anyone who's interested in the nitty-gritty of it all. Phase 2 is designing the projects with a third design that was just presented in April of this year. 3 initial design scenarios for Bolden Island were presented. These 3 scenarios meet the project objectives to varying degrees. They include a set of adaptations, including managed wetlands, tidal wetlands, floating wetlands, polluticulture, new word for me, which means wet agriculture, levee improvements, and geologic carbon sequestration. Based on workshop feedback, these scenarios were further refined, resulting in a near-term preferred land use scenario, and then 5 long-term scenario options intended to represent a playbook for how land use might evolve beyond the near-term scenario, climate change and everything else that could happen in the future. Each of these scenarios is based on different if-then propositions, suggesting adaptive pathways for different potential futures. A key assumption for the long-term scenarios is that alternative sources of income will be available for financing necessary construction and covering operation and maintenance costs that could change what viable land uses are possible on Bolden Island, because, there always has to be a financial piece to it. So let's look at the potential adaptations that they could do on Bolden Island. Tidal wetlands. Tidal wetlands represent the historic conditions present in the Delta. Tidal action was a dominant physical process. It dictated the frequency with which wetlands were saturated and flooded, keeping channels, and they kept channels sized appropriately for the tidal prism. They influenced tidal channel morphology, reduced riverine flood heights, controlled marsh plain elevations and peat accumulation rates. They promoted habitat connectivity, affected species assemblages, and aided the exchange of nutrients and biota through the delta ecosystem. However, tidal wetlands require elevations close to the high tide mark, which is a difficult task for much of Bolden Island due to current conditions and ongoing subsidence. Like we just said, you see subsidence up to 25 feet below sea level in a lot of the delta. And if you remember that issue with Westlands Water District a few months ago, it's pretty hard to reach that high tide mark. Another option is creating habitat diversity in seasonal and managed wetlands. So habitat diversity can be created within these habitats through modest earth moving. By excavating and mounding, which is generally balancing on-site cut and fill, topographic variations would be introduced, creating shallow depressions or ponds, and elevated berms, creating transitional zones within each habitat. I'm going to note that modest is a descriptor by UC Davis. I don't know what the experts would say about what's modest, but for now, we'll use their word. So this will likely create perennial ponds and willow thickets in the managed wetlands. In the seasonal wetlands, the depressions may develop pockets of wetter or perennial wetlands, and the mounds could create a range of transitional habitats, such as floodplain grasslands, consisting of a mix of grasses and wetland plants that historically existed in the central delta, but have since been lost, especially due to subsidence. These habitats have high ecocultural value. They tend to occur in sandier, less peaty soils, which is where they would be located in this design. Managed wetlands are human-built systems designed to mimic natural wetland ecosystems. Tidal inputs do not influence these areas and have been constructed within Delta Island interiors in conjunction with agricultural land use. These wetlands are temporarily to permanently flooded, permanently saturated, freshwater on Bolden Island, not necessarily for other islands if they were to repeat this, and dominated by emergent vegetation. In case of the DIA project, they will experiment with different wetland designs and assess potential outcomes for habitat value, soil accretion potential, secondary production, and water quality. Floating peat wetlands, which I think is pretty interesting. Floating peat wetlands can likely provide primary protection that supports food webs for endangered species such as the delta smelt, the longfin smelt, and the salmonids. In the Bolden Island floating experimental wetland pools, data collected by the UC Center for Watershed Sciences demonstrated substantially increased zooplankton populations relative to the adjacent channel water samples. So a lot more in there than the kind of more wide open channels that you see, the long canals. They found a lot more zooplankton in these little peat areas where there's more vegetation. The zooplankton community consisted of small-bodied cladocerans, which are water fleas, gets me itchy just thinking about it, and cyclopoid and calanoid copepods. Moreover, wetland vegetation roots are home to high densities of insects and amphipods common in the diets of many fish species. Fish benefits would manifest from a connection with these surrounding channels. So in a nutshell, this would be a great source of food for fishies. Another version of floating peat wetlands include a non-tidally connected, shallower impounded wetland. This option would not include a tidal gate and much lower cross levees at the perimeter of the wetland. Without the tidal gate, this adaptation will rely on existing siphon infrastructure to pull water from the channel and pumps to export water at regular intervals to kind of maintain what they think is the right amount. This version can provide a much lower initial cost to implement than the tidal floating wetlands, meet multiple objectives, include reversing subsidence and sequestering carbon while still providing habitat and primary food production. Paludoculture is the productive land use of wet and re-wetted peatlands that preserves the peat soil and minimizes carbon dioxide emissions and subsidence. With paludoculture, peatlands are kept productive under permanently wet, peat-conserving, and potentially peat-forming conditions. Thus, it's a blueprint for the peatland carbon farming while still producing food, feed, and energy. This is comprised of various agricultural systems that target the production of plant or animal-based commodities, from harvesting vegetation or semi-natural sites to establishing specific permanent crops. This one I think is pretty interesting in terms of its potential for what it could do around the world. Biomass importation will be explored on various test plots with different materials and construction. The main concept is to import biomass from orchard pull-ups, landfill diversion, forest management, and even biomass produced on Bolden itself, like invasive aquatic plant species or crop waste. This land use adaptation opens the door for continuing dry forms of agriculture while building a new soil horizon. However, there's little research on how these techniques affect peat soils on both short and long term, making this pilot project extremely valuable for other subsided river deltas worldwide. Levee improvements, we're always calling for levee improvements. Levee improvements are planned primarily along the McCollum River to improve levee conditions and create edge of channel habitats, improvements for migrating salmon and other species. Levee improvements could range from conventional engineering improvements such as widening, raising, toe berm construction, and revetment installation to multi-benefit designs such as setback levees. Setback levees have been moved further away from the river and are typically designed with a more shallow outer slope, and the central delta setback levees could improve channel capacity and levee resiliency. However, their main benefit is improved edge habitat and potential wetland creation in that setback area. Geologic carbon capture, I mean, we already talked about this. I think we all know how this works, know what we think and feel about this one. So, now this one, so those are the different options, and then this is their near-term scenario. So for the next 10 to 20 years, what is the preferred scenario when you look at all of these options? This proposal could begin to be implemented immediately and be fully in place within 10 years. The island is designed as a mosaic of land uses, half of which consists of wet soil agriculture of the paludoculture, and the other half being a range of restored aquatic and terrestrial habitats. So 50% of this wet ag or paludoculture would be actively farmed wetlands. Existing drainage infrastructure can be used and will be maintained to manage water levels for drainage and planting and harvesting rice and polluted areas, but there will be 0%, absolutely no dry soil agriculture. The other 50% will be for ecological restoration of terrestrial and aquatic habitats. 31% will be wetlands, 21% of that will be managed, 8% will be the floating tidal, and 2% will be filled tidal. 16% of this half will be transitional or upland habitats. So that's 10% seasonal wetlands, 2% riparian, 2% upland, 5% levee grassland. And it integrates the sovereign slow restoration concept with muted tidal connection for water level management. So for these long-term proposals, they represent longer-term visions of island evolution, taking into account changes in technology, policy and governance, and climate change effects such as sea level rise, maybe arguably the Delta Tunnel and other things that they're planning to do in the Delta region over the next 20 to 50 years, if they were to happen. Specifically, these proposals assume the potential application of carbon capture and expanding conservation and climate adaptation incentives, such as the 30 by 30 goals, which could offset revenue losses from a transition from agriculture. So they are considering, if they move out of agriculture, how could they use this carbon capture to kind of offset the impact to the economy? There are 5 really detailed long-term scenarios that would take me another hour to explain, but if you want to read more, this is the link, and I'm happy to send it to anyone who's interested. But these are all different scenarios that kind of, it's scenario planning, so it's based on what would the impact be, and what are the things that are going to happen in our climate, both environmentally and politically, in the next 10-20 years before this 20 to 50 year plan hits. So besides Bolden Island, Met's also looking at blue carbon capture, or all the things we just talked about kind of rolled into one phrase would be blue carbon capture in the web tract. And that recent grant application is what sparked the interest for this webinar. So the $20.9 million grant from the Delta Conservancy for Metropolitan, that lasts for 3 years. The land is part of this experiment for the next 15 years. Met can sell the land, but whoever buys it has to maintain the rules of the experiment. Met decided to apply for the grant and partake in the experiment because of the multiple benefits to web tract. The surrounding area has some pretty challenging subsidence, and this should really help with the subsidence, and then it'll increase the value of the land, capture the carbon, which could also get Metropolitan some credits in the future, depending on how it works out. And then, of course, secure levees against earthquakes. Although I will say some board members did fear a long-term maintenance nightmare, just kind of understandable, I suppose. The grant will fund design, environmental documentation, permitting, and construction of wetlands, rice fields, and associated improvements on web tract over a 3-year period. The grant will also fund quantification of greenhouse gas emissions before and after construction to calculate greenhouse gas reductions realized from the project. So, like I said, they may get credits for this, they may not. It depends on how this all works out. Metropolitan anticipates providing about $3 million of in-kind staff services to match the grant award. So they do have some skin in the game. The project will incorporate vegetation management to encourage establishment of native vegetation, and will include adaptive management strategies to enhance the ecosystem benefits. While the project supports the conservation goals enhanced by the state's 30 by 30 initiative, the project will not provide mitigation for existing and proposed projects, including the Delta Conveyance Project. So again, this is not related to the Delta Tunnel. This is really more about the state's 30 by 30 goals. The goals of this grant are to stop or reverse subsidence, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, generate carbon offsets. It's part of Metropolitan's climate action plan. It'll generate some income from these carbon credits if it actually works, which it probably will. Generate lease income from rice fields, so kind of reducing the cost for us ratepayers. And then augment the Delta Pelagic food web, so more food for the fishies. As of June, right now, this project was added to Met's capital investment plan. This upcoming fall, they'll begin the planning, the public outreach, so they'll talk to us about it. and they'll start designing in their environmental documentation. So getting more specific about what actually this will look like. You can see on this map what they're planning to do, but they'll start talking about, okay, what does it really mean? And then in spring of 2025, the grant will be awarded and they'll start the construction. So this presentation was meant to let you draw your own conclusions on which forms of carbon storage solutions are the best choices for the Delta. But it's clear to me anyway that some ideas are better than others. And it'll be really interesting to see how these different projects play out depending on who's running them or not. Here are my sources if you want to do any further reading. And we can now have a little chat about it. So I know that was a lot.
It's a lot, yeah.
It was a lot.
So how do we get the links?
I'll send it to you. I'll send it to you with the ones in the beginning. I promised Karen for the petitions.
Okay. Yeah, you can just send it to those of us that.
Yeah. I'll send it to everyone who's here tonight. Yeah.
Okay.
Any major takeaways from this? I had a few.
It's a lot of it's confusing. Are we in terms of the specific islands that are left, the 4 islands that Met has? I was confused as to whether we were just focusing on those islands, or could any of these possibilities be done on the other islands?
Yes. So, and then that's what I was talking about with so Delta Conservancy, they already do some of these things in some of these, some other islands. And then the carbon offset programs, really anyone can be a part of that, which typically means wealthy people. And then companies that produce a lot of carbon dioxide. So oil companies, like they said, cement kiln, petroleum, coal, all of that. So they can buy up the carbon offset, which means they would fund these kinds of projects on other islands. So those are all possibilities. Specifically for Metropolitan, these are some pilot programs that they're like actual functioning programs with, theories, and they're testing to see how it works. So they've got that Bolden Island adaptation, a Delta adaptation program. They're doing that with UC Davis. And then they're just about to start this web track program. So these are 2 specific things that we can follow over the next few years and see how they're doing. But yes, they have possibilities all over the place. And I suppose, there's no reason why someone couldn't do this, even if they weren't seeking carbon offset. If, a farmer just said, hey, I want to do more for subsidence and carbon capture, they certainly could.
Yeah, we desperately need to do something about the subsidence and the restoration of the wetlands, and the peat. It's just like up in Alaska, when it's exposed, then it's just emitting tons of CO2.
Yeah.
I mean, I think all of this stuff that would essentially be restoring functioning, healthy environment that we've went in, and sort of bludgeoned to death in our not understanding how systems worked and not listening to indigenous people who did understand and so forth. I mean, those things, and looking at how those things work, all sound really promising to me. What I do not want to see is the pipelines and the
Exactly.
I think that's incredibly dangerous. And also because like all these other kinds of really dangerous things, they end up having the most impact on the poorest people and the environmental justice community. I mean, that's another reason I've discovered came across Satartia, Mississippi, I don't know, a year or so ago, and read some things that was just a terrifying thing that happened. And it was just all about greed, and a company not caring, and no research, and permits being issued with no thought. And I think the attitude was, oh, well, those people can't fight back. So,
they're collateral.
They're collateral damage. And that's the kind of stuff I don't want to see anywhere. And I think it's, really something to fight.
So how would these projects be effective if the tunnel were to happen?
Well, the tunnel wouldn't be on these particular islands, which is why they are moving forward with them. The tunnel, if it were to happen, would be probably the Bethany alternative or the central or eastern alignment. So those would just be in another direction. That's kind of why they're like, okay, well, what do we do with these islands now that we bought them and we're not going to have a tunnel going through here? That's kind of how all this really came about, because they also said, we lost kind of the value on the land for a little bit, so they need the land to appreciate, and this is one way that they could appreciate the land. Well, they also, I mean, they do care about the delta health, because then that affects the, if the levees were to collapse, then they couldn't move the water, and they need the water quality to be well. So all of this, it works together. Some of it might be a little selfish, but some of it could be pro-environment. But yeah, that's kind of how it all got started, at least for these very specific island programs.
It always seems like there's unintended consequences. I mean, I don't see how you could put something that large in there and not have, effects to things that are around it. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. But what about the so you got to the point about the ones that were best about were creating habitat for fish, because I'm sitting there going, how's any of this going to help the fish? What about saltwater intrusion? Does it play a role in this at all?
Well, it depends on what it is. So like they said, they're doing a combination of things. I think levees, yes, levees would help. The geologic carbon capture, no, that wouldn't help. Well, actually, they were saying that the geologic carbon capture, the one we're not crazy about, that one works better with salt water, deep in those levels of strata they were talking about. So I could see that being something that comes up again in the future, that's saying, well, while we've got the salt water over here, let's go do this here, which could be something we might need to fight someday. I haven't seen discussions of that right now, but maybe. In terms of fighting the saltwater sea level intrusion, I'm not seeing the connection for any of these preventing it, but I mean, maybe someone would.
If you began to deal with subsidence and were successful with that,
Yeah.
it would seem to me like that would help, because right now we've got the combination of sea level rise and then this very significant subsidence because of the ways that the land has been used and abused. And
yeah, that's true. Anything that would create higher
natural cycle.
Yeah, anything that would create the higher berms, and then that managed wetlands where they would be creating some of the berms where they're trying to make those shallow ponds. So anything that would be on the edge of the shallow ponds, and then those the edge habitat that they were trying to create, maybe all of that could actually prevent some of that saltwater intruding. You're right. Yeah. Ken?
No, I just wanted to add, it's kind of on the same point that the delta is below sea level, and the oceans rise. You're gonna have more fresh water coming out of the delta towards the San Francisco Bay if you're trying to maintain salinity at a reasonable level. And it's been forecasted if it really gets out of hand, the water from the delta will not be potable anymore, and not even for agriculture. There'll be too much salt in it. And they won't use it for anything except
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
So it could be a real catastrophic situation. And if another big earthquake and they lose a couple of nice little levees, that could cause the same thing even before sea level rise. But sea level rise right now is a factor in the what is that, Carquinez Straits, that area of the delta. Well, I don't even know if that's in the delta. It's between the delta and the bay. Like the city of Antioch, they wanted what, $18 million from the state because they no longer can use the water they counted on historically. It's gone now. They can't use it. There's too much salt in it, and those kind of events are just going to get worse.
Yeah.
not without us doing anything. I mean, if climate change keeps going on and we get warmer and warmer, the ocean's going to rise more and more.
Yeah. Yeah, the tidal wetlands could, if they were to build up the tidal wetlands as part of this project, that could definitely help with some saltwater intrusion. But like they said, that's hard to do when, you know, so much of it is below sea level. So maybe if the other parts of the program built it up a bit, and then they could increase more of those tidal wetlands, that might be a possibility. Wes wanted to know about what kind of money they're going to get for the carbon offset. I've heard some of the directors complain that they never get money for carbon offset credits. And I think right now, I think at this very moment, June 2023, I don't think that they have those kinds of predictions, but that's what they're going to come out with this fall. So I'll report back when they know them. And then in terms of potential buyers, well, now they just signed into this that it'll be at least 3 years before they can lease it out, any of this land. So maybe in those 3 years from now, I know they had some big potential buyers fall of last year, but then they decided to go in this direction instead. I thought we were going to fight it out in the winter, but this seems like, well, this is the direction that they went in. So.
I mean, one of the other problems with this is the sort of the moral hazard problem of letting fossil fuel companies buy offsets that allows them to keep going. So then you have this madness of, on the one hand, you're restoring things that over the long term could potentially really heal the land and be helpful, at the same time that you're allowing people to spew out exactly what's led to the problem in the first place. And
Yeah.
Well, exactly, especially if the Peo Sky and SB 438, if that all works out, and then they say they use these kind of little loopholes to then like make it worse, if they give themselves the permission to then say, well, we have to keep, you know, driving this carbon down in there, and if it spills, well, then, you know, if we happen to pull out some oil in the process, yeah, that can't happen. So you know, none of this works. That's ideally what I would like to see in the future, that, you know, governments realize, hey, this blue carbon capture, this peat, this these Thule ideas, rice, any of that is a much better way to store carbon than all these pipelines. I just know that, I mean, a good chunk of this country is not wetlands, it's prairie, it's grasslands, it's mountains. So, I mean, I see that, you know, I think they said 55,000 miles of pipeline already in the works for the next few years, but hopefully we'll go back in that peak direction. Ken?
The other thing with wetlands is, how do you increase the storage? And you're limited by the number of acres you have to work with, or whatever. And if you need more carbon storage, where are you going to get it? Not that I agree that putting it in the ground is a potential problem either. I really would prefer that they not produce the carbon dioxide to begin with.
Well, you know, reforestation is another way to do it, and the world could definitely use more trees, and that's another multi-benefit nature-based approach. So is it as profitable for oil companies? No, but that's an option.
No, I haven't seen any studies on it. I was just wondering if the decline in rainforest acreage, is that, how much of a contribution is that to the increase in carbon in the atmosphere?
I heard a year ago it was about 33%, but don't quote me on that. And actually, interestingly enough, while we're talking about offsets, I just heard about biodiversity offsets, which is really sad, but in Uganda, there somebody wants to dig up a forest for something, and they estimated how many chimpanzees they're going to kill, and they did it first by, okay, if we take this much land, you know, that's food from these chimps, and then the stress of it means the females aren't going to be able to reproduce. So they looked at longitudinally, they estimated this could mean 243 less chimpanzees. So what they're doing now is a biodiversity offset. So in other parts of the country, where chimps exist. They're going to then protect and reforest areas that could see up to 15,000 chimpanzees proliferate by doing that instead. I don't really like the idea of trading one chimp for another, but at least they're putting something back in other areas. And
That's awful.
yeah.
I'm sorry. They're always coming up with these schemes to do something here and move it over there and try, we're going to cut this down and we're going to plant it over here. And then of course it burns up. I mean, the carbon that was sequestered when the fires, that stuff had been offsets for companies. So, I mean, it's all theoretical. It's all on paper. And, and it just
and
doesn't.
we now credit them with all these offsets, and instead we have 10 times the carbon because of the fires.
Right.
But they were able to produce that much more oil and gas and coal because they used the I mean, we won't be dealing with reality until we get to the point of saying that money, including lots of public money, needs to go toward restoring as much of the ecosystems as we possibly can, preserving what we haven't totally wrecked, and then restoring more of it while phasing out fossil fuels. I mean, that's only
it's simple, but
humanity. But the politics and the money and the billionaires that buy the politicians, it's absolutely insane. I mean, the other argument, and I fill it out on petitions and make it comments every time that I get a chance, is on the military budget. And so if you took a bunch of that, and if you want real security and you want to avoid future wars, if you took a bunch of that and put it into funding restoration of ecosystems, including really doing that in the countries where we've gone in and just left them polluted from taking out their natural resources, that would be even in the midterm, I think, the most effective way to avoid more horrendous war and the environmental destruction that goes with that. But there are so many entrenched interests that sanity doesn't seem to be a consideration. It's just so frustrating.
Yeah.
It's always about mitigation rather than anything that really needs to happen.
Mitigation and trying to rebuild and undo damage. I watched something the other day, and it was like what the state is planning to do with its 30 by 30 and lands that they have identified. And the one really positive thing in that, but we need way more lands and way more of this, was they are bringing in the tribes and their wisdom to do the work, which is exactly what we need. And one of the things that I was wondering when I was, watching this is the program with UCD, or do they have any space for indigenous cooperation and learning from the original inhabitants of this land, who were pushed off? There's a very small restoration program going on in Sacramento right now, called the Bushy Lake Restoration, and it's training graduate students in their ecology program. And I know the professor that's leading it, because back when the Climate Sangha still met, she was a member of the Climate Sangha. She's also indigenous from one of the Washington tribes. So she and the students have been working with the former inhabitants of that land, who have all this knowledge about what were the plants that were destroyed, and and they're replanting what had been there. And that's the kind of thing that just needs to be
Yeah.
just hugely expanded
Mhm.
and respected. And I'm happy every time I hear that they're going to be indigenous partners
Mhm.
involved, because I feel like, oh, well, there'll be more sanity. And I know that there are more indigenous people who end up becoming professors and things, and in positions where they can use their knowledge and bring in more people. But that's the stuff we need.
Mhm. I hope they'll be compensated appropriately for all of this work as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I will say, lots of Indigenous folks involved on the Day of Action next week. It was their baby from the start. It was their idea. They did most of the planning. So, that's a big part of it. In terms of the projects we discussed today, I know the Miwok people are involved in the Delta Islands Adaptation, which is the Bolden Island program. I'm not sure about any of the other projects. Ken?
No, I was just ongoing with the same thing, carbon capture. And I've tried to find some information on it, but it doesn't seem to be available to me.
I'll send you the resources from this.
I've got it, but how long, in my mind, is kind of a boondoggle. They're gonna, people are gonna pay money because they're gonna do the right thing and then conserve the environment by paying money to create offsets. But then who's monitoring, and to what degree are they monitoring the storage of this carbon dioxide that people have paid for? And also, probably more important, how long is that storage good for? Is it really
That's
being
it.
monitored? I mean, California can't even monitor their own agricultural water supplies. How are they going to monitor something as nebulous as CO2 in the ground?
Mhm.
It just seems like this setting up the mitigation is there on paper, but it's meaningless because there's really no way of knowing and defining it.
Yeah, the MVA system I talked about is how they monitor it, but it's not clear how long they're going to monitor it for. How long can this sit in the ground for? Is it 100 years? Is it 1,000? Is it 10,000? I don't know how long humans will still be on this planet, but at what point? And then what about the big one? If we get that really big earthquake and it hits all this carbon that's stored underground, then what? Yeah, a lot of scary questions.
Yeah, that's a hugely, and I was reading somewhere it was talking about the potential pressure of that carbon stored underground, that like the pressure with the situation where the fracking has triggered earthquakes because of and carbon capture and storage seems to me like another recipe for earthquakes, and you're doing it in a state like California where you have natural seismicity in much of the state. So so that I would think would increase the risk. And how is that being factored in? And we somehow keep finding new faults after we've done something, after we've allegedly the big fault that runs under Diablo Canyon was found after it was built. So we have, thanks to Newsom, we've prolonged its operation and it's sitting on top of a fault. And if that ruptures, we got Fukushima again.
Yep. You are not wrong. Like I said, Steve Meltzer, he was saying, I looked it up again. If they don't take out enough, but they put more in, if they don't get that mass balance or the right balance of the pressure in the underground shelf, it'll turn into earthquakes. It will create earthquakes. And I'm thinking, how long can someone stay on top of that? How long can they maintain that? And then the mass changes, as you know, over a couple 100 years, or maybe even less than that with climate change, who knows? But as things rot and we become we become dirt and everything else becomes dirt on top of it. What does that do? As the layers of dirt rise up, what does that do? As they fix subsidence in parts of the delta, if they've got geologic carbon capture in other parts of the delta, will the change in the subsidence make it, even trying to fix the subsidence, will that create more mass and then create a problem there? Or, conversely, maybe it's not just adding more mass. It could probably also be taking away mass. So as subsidence gets worse in some areas, does that also create a problem? Does a change in the amount of ground around these areas, is that a problem? And I'm thinking probably yes.
Probably yes, or at best, it's like, we don't know, so we'll just do it anyway.
Yep, in EJ communities, of course.
How the
Of course.
powers that be think.
They destroy and move on to destroy
Yeah.
something else.
As long as it's destroyed after their term is up, can't blame me.
Well, let's look forward to next week when we're gonna get together and have a rah-rah good time. Learn
Exactly.